3 True School Horror Stories. The Secret of the Abandoned Teaching Building. When I was in high school, there was an abandoned teaching building at our school, standing alone in a corner of the campus, starkly contrasting with the brand new teaching area. It was said to be decades old and had been abandoned after suffering severe damage from a fire. There were various eerie legends surrounding the abandoned building. Some classmates claimed that late at night, a faint light could be seen flickering inside, as if someone were lighting candles. Others said they had heard mournful cries coming from within, sending shivers down their spines. A few curious classmates and I were half believing these legends, but our urge to explore the building was overwhelming. Finally, one weekend evening, when most students had gone home, we stealthily made our way to the abandoned teaching building. As we approached the building, a musty, decaying odor hit us. The door was secured with a rusty lock, but a few panes of glass in the nearby windows were broken, allowing us to carefully climb inside. Inside was pitch dark, and we could only navigate by the faint light from our phones. The hallway was thick with dust, and the walls were peeling, revealing mottled bricks underneath. As we walked, we reached the floor where the fire had occurred. The scene here was even more tragic. The ceiling was charred black, and in some places, burnt wooden beams lay in ruins. While we were examining the area, a sudden gust of cold wind swept through, causing our phone lights to flicker and then extinguish completely. Darkness enveloped us, and panic instantly set in. Panic, it's probably just the batteries dying. Let's not move for now. Lines look for a spare battery, I said, trying to sound calm. However, as I rummaged through my bag for a spare battery, I heard a strange sound. It resembled someone quietly crying, mixed with the sharp screech of nails on a chalkboard, echoing in the eerie silence of the abandoned building, sending chills down my spine. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice trembling. Yes, what is that sound? My classmates replied, equally frightened. Just then, I suddenly felt a cold hand resting on my shoulder. The icy touch froze me in place, and I couldn't even scream. Slowly, I turned my head, and in the dim light of the moon, I saw a face so pale it was devoid of color. Its dark eyes seemed capable of sucking in one's soul. The face was so close that I could feel its icy breath. I distinctly saw its lips quivering as if it wanted to say something, but all that came out was a hissing sound, like a snake flicking its tongue, terrifyingly sinister. I finally couldn't hold back and screamed. My classmates followed suit, and we all ran desperately back the way we came, not caring about direction, just wanting to escape this horrifying place. Oddly enough, after running for what felt like a long time, we found ourselves still wandering the same floor. We had clearly passed several hallways and classrooms, but each time we turned a corner, we ended up right back where we started. What's going on? Are we stuck in a ghost wall? One classmate shouted, trembling. Fear gripped our hearts even tighter, and our steps grew frantic. No matter how hard we tried to change our path, we were stuck in this seemingly familiar yet bizarre maze of hallways. In the chaos, I tripped and fell, scraping my palm, but I couldn't focus on the pain, and got back up to keep running. At that moment, the mournful cries seemed to surround us, as if some vengeful spirit was closely following us, mocking our helplessness. Just when we were almost in despair, I recalled something an elder had once said, when caught in a ghost wall, one could try closing their eyes, and walking straight based on their instincts. I hurriedly shared this method with my classmates, and though they were skeptical, we had no other options at that moment. We closed our eyes, held hands, and tried to walk in a straight line based on our feelings. With every step, it felt like our hearts might leap out of our throats, terrified of ending up back at the start. I don't know how long we walked, but when we finally opened our eyes, we found ourselves at the staircase, finally able to leave this floor. We felt a huge sense of relief and rushed downstairs. As we reached the first floor lobby, thinking we could finally escape this terrifying building, a more horrifying sight awaited us. In the center of the lobby stood a figure in tattered school uniform, with charred remnants on it, as if it were a victim of that terrible fire. The figure faced away from us, motionless, yet radiating a suffocating, eerie aura. Our feet froze involuntarily, fear washed over us like a tide. In that moment of shock, a figure slowly turned around. Its face was covered in burn scars, flesh twisted grotesquely, one eye was hollow, while the other glowed an eerie red. Its mouth hung open, emitting a bizarre, raspy laugh that echoed in the empty lobby, sending pain through our eardrums. "Why have you come here?" it asked in a hoarse voice. "Sir," as if it came from the depths of hell. We trembled in fear, unable to answer. At that moment, all we wanted was to turn and run, but our legs felt as though they were nailed to the ground, unable to move. "Are you here to keep me company? Ha 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 ha," it continued to laugh chillingly as it began to walk towards us. With each step, it left a black footprint on the floor, as if it were a demon emerging from a dark abyss. Just as it was about to reach us, a car horn blared outside, shattering the eerie atmosphere. The figure in the burned uniform seemed startled, it flickered and vanished. We snapped back to reality, too frightened to think, and sprinted out of the building. When we finally escaped the abandoned teaching building, and ran into the bright open space outside, we collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. From that day on, we dared not approach the abandoned building again, and the eerie experience inside became a nightmare we could never erase from our minds. Every time I passed by that building at night, I felt as if I could still hear those mournful cries coming from within, as if some vengeful spirit lingered there, recounting its tragic fate. The mysterious girl in the library. The library of the university I attended is a magnificent building, housing a vast collection of books, making it a favorite spot for students. However, within this seemingly tranquil library, an incident occurred that still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. One evening, close to exam week, the library was bustling with people, all absorbed in their studies, preparing for the upcoming tests. I was no exception. I found an empty spot in a corner of the library, and began to review diligently. After some time, I started to feel tired and lifted my head to stretch my neck. At that moment, I noticed a girl standing nearby by the bookshelves. She was wearing a white dress, and her long hair almost reached her waist. She stood quietly, holding a book, seemingly engrossed in reading. At first, I didn't pay much attention, assuming she was another student studying in the library. However, as time passed, I sensed something was off about her. She remained in the same spot, her posture unchanged, and no one around seemed to notice her presence. Feeling puzzled, I decided to walk over and take a look. As I approached her, I noticed the book in her hands was blank, not a single word on its pages. This added to my confusion, so I quietly asked, "Excuse me, why is your book blank?" She didn't respond, merely lifted her head slowly. When I saw her face, I couldn't help but gasp. Her complexion was as pale as snow, her lips devoid of color, and her eyes were hollow and soulless. "Can you see me?" she asked in a cold voice, as if it were coming from a distant place. I was startled by her words, a sense of foreboding swelling within me. But I forced myself to stay calm, and replied, "Of course I can see you. What's wrong?" She fell silent again, staring at me, with a profound sadness in her eyes. After a moment, she sighed softly and turned to walk deeper into the library. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow her. She walked slowly, and I trailed behind her, weaving through rows of bookshelves, until we reached a secluded corner of the library. This area was usually deserted, the lighting dim. She stopped in front of a bookshelf and extended her hand to gently caress a book on the shelf. As I stepped closer, I saw the title of the book was The Vanished Soul. Just as I was contemplating this, the lights around us began to flicker violently, as if a mysterious force was disrupting them. Then, I heard a low humming sound that grew louder, threatening to deafen me. In the midst of the chaos, I saw the girl's figure start to blur, her body seeming to slowly dissipate into wisps of smoke. "No." I instinctively reached out to grab her, but my hand passed through her body, grasping nothing. As the last wisp of smoke vanished, the lights returned to normal, and the humming ceased. Everything felt as if nothing had happened, except for the book, The Vanished Soul, which lay quietly on the shelf. With a racing heart, I picked up the book and opened it to discover a tragic story. It turned out that this girl had once been a student at the school, deeply passionate about reading, often spending entire days in the library. However, she had tragically passed away in an accident, and her spirit lingered here, unable to leave due to her love for the library, becoming a ghost. From that night on, whenever the library quieted down, she would appear again, wandering among the shelves in search of the books she never finished reading or reliving the words he once cherished. That evening, I found myself once again in the library, burning the midnight oil to review my work. As the crowd thinned out and the lights dimmed, I suddenly felt a chill creeping up my spine, as if a cold presence had stealthily approached me. I turned instinctively and saw the girl in white once more. She stood not far from me, her figure flickering, as if she could disappear at any moment. Her eyes remained hollow and lifeless, staring directly at me, sending shivers down my spine. I tried to pretend I didn't see her and quickly returned my gaze to my book, but my eyes kept drifting toward her. Just then, she slowly approached me, her footsteps soundless, as if she were not touching the ground at all. When she stood right in front of me, I could feel a wave of icy air hit me, so cold it made me shudder. She lowered her head, leaning closer, and I could see her expressionless, pale face, those hollow eyes seeming to peer into my very soul. "Why have you come here again?" her voice whispered in my ear, cold and tinged with resentment. "Do you know how lonely I am? Here, only books can keep me company, yet I can never truly touch them again." I trembled with fear, my lips quivering but unable to utter a word. Seeing my silence, she reached out her hand, icy as a block of ice, wanting to touch my face. I wanted to pull away, but my body felt frozen, unable to move. Just as her hand was about to reach my face, suddenly, the library lights flickered violently, then half of them went out, leaving only a few emergency lights casting a dim glow. In this dim light, the girl's figure became even more eerie. Her hair began to float, as if an invisible wind were blowing. A glint of red seemed to flash in her eyes, making her appear even more terrifying. "Since you can see me, stay with me here, forever," her voice echoed in the darkness, carrying an undeniable tone. I struggled desperately, wanting to escape this paralyzing state. Suddenly, I recalled hearing that ghosts fear bright lights, so I frantically pulled out my phone from my bag, switched on the flashlight, and pointed it at the girl. The bright light shone directly on her, and she emitted a piercing scream that echoed hauntingly in the silent library, sending chills down my spine. Her figure began to sway violently, as if she were enduring immense pain. The midnight cry in the dormitory. In college, I lived in a 4-person dormitory, and my roommates and I got along fairly well. However, during our sophomore year, something happened that plunged our entire dorm into fear. It was an ordinary night. After finishing our nightly routines, my roommates and I lay in bed, ready to sleep. The lights in the dorm had been turned off, and only the faint moonlight filtering in through the window kept the room from being completely dark. As I was drifting off to sleep, I suddenly heard a faint crying. The sound was soft, but in the silence of the night, it was exceptionally clear, as if it were coming from far away, yet somehow right in our dorm. I jolted awake, straining to listen. I thought perhaps one of my roommates was having a nightmare or had encountered something upsetting, so I whispered, "Who's crying? Did someone have a nightmare?" But no one replied. The crying continued intermittently. Feeling a bit strange, I turned on my bedside lamp, and looked at my roommates. They were all lying in bed, eyes tightly closed, apparently fast asleep. No one was crying. A chill crept over me. Could the crying be coming from outside? I got out of bed and walked to the window, looking outside. The hallway was eerily quiet, with no one around, and it didn't seem to be coming from outside. Just as I was feeling puzzled, the crying suddenly grew louder and sounded even more heartbreaking, as if someone was crying out in extreme despair. Terrified, I rushed back to bed and buried my head under the covers, praying for the crying to stop. After a while, the crying seemed to soften a bit, but it was still clearly audible. I peeked out from under the covers to check on my roommates. They seemed to have been awakened by the crying, each showing signs of fear. "What's going on?" asked my roommate Xiao Li, his voice trembling. "I don't know. At first, I thought one of you was crying," I replied. Just as we exchanged worried glances, we suddenly heard a strange sound, like someone dragging heavy footsteps, slowly approaching our dorm. The footsteps were slow, but each step felt as if it was heavily weighing on our hearts, causing our pulses to quicken. Could it be someone playing a prank? Xiao Zhang suggested, trying to reassure himself, though his voice was clearly shaking. We all fell silent, just listening as the footsteps drew nearer. When they stopped outside our dorm door, we held our breaths, afraid to make a sound. After a moment, the doorknob jiggled, as if someone were trying to open our door. We huddled together in fright, our eyes fixed on the door. Just as the door was about to open, a loud crowing of a rooster suddenly pierced the air. The crow seemed to break a strange atmosphere, and immediately, the footsteps disappeared, and the crying gradually ceased. We spent the rest of that night in terror, and the next morning, we reported the incident to the dormitory supervisor. After listening to our account, the supervisor's expression grew serious. She informed us that years ago, a student had committed suicide in our dormitory building. The student had hanged himself over a romantic issue, and since then, there had been frequent reports of midnight crying and strange footsteps, said to be the vengeful spirit of that student. Learning this news made us even more frightened, but we had no choice but to continue living in the dorm. From that night on, we silently prayed whenever darkness fell, hoping we wouldn't hear that midnight cry, or those strange footsteps again, as that chilling feeling was truly unbearable. However, the terrifying events were far from over. They escalated even further. A few days later, on a moonless night, the dorm was particularly quiet, only the faint sounds of my roommates breathing. I was in a half-asleep state when suddenly, a bone-chilling cold washed over me. Instinctively, I pulled my blanket tighter, but the cold seemed to come me not from outside, but rather from deep within me. At that moment, the familiar midnight cry rang out again, starting as a low whimper and gradually escalating into heart-wrenching sobs that echoed in the silent dorm, sending shivers down our spines. As the crying grew louder, the temperature in the dorm dropped sharply. I could see my breath as white mist, as if I had been thrust into the depths of winter. Then, we heard a strange scratching noise, like someone clawing at the wall, the sound of nails scraping across the surface producing an ear-piercing squeak. The noise grew louder, as if something was desperately trying to break through the wall. We were all startled awake, hurriedly turning on our bedside lamps. However, the lights flickered incessantly, as if they might go out at any moment. Under the dimming and brightening light, we saw dark streaks appearing on the dorm walls, as if someone had drawn on them with charred fingers. These streaks continued to spread and twist, gradually forming a vague human outline. What is happening? Xia Wang's voice trembled in fear. We watched in horror as the figure on the wall became clearer, its head, limbs slowly revealing themselves until a complete human form seemed to be imprinted on the wall. It had long, unkempt hair, a twisted face, hollow, soulless eyes, and its mouth was wide open, emitting that sorrowful cry, as if lamenting endless grievances. Before we could recover from this shocking scene, the dormitory door suddenly swung open with a loud bang. A chilling wind rushed in, causing our blankets to flutter ominously. We huddled together, eyes glued to the door. A figure slowly floated in from outside, dressed in a tattered nightgown, just like the one worn by the student who had committed suicide. Her hair was wet, clinging to her face, her complexion pale as paper, devoid of color, and her eyes glowed with an eerie red light. It seemed as though her feet didn't touch the ground. She drifted towards us. "Why are you living here?" An icy voice echoed in the dorm, seeming to come from the depths of hell, sending chills down our spines. We trembled, unable to respond to her question. At that moment, the figure on the wall appeared to come to life, slowly separating from the wall and approaching us. With each step, it left behind a black footprint on the ground, as if it carried endless darkness and sorrow. The two ghosts closed in on us, slowly cornering us against the dorm's wall. We clung tightly together, finding it hard to breathe, filled with despair. Just when we thought our lives were about to end, suddenly, Xiao Li, summoning an unknown courage, grabbed a thick book from his bedside, and threw it at the floating ghost. The book passed through the ghost, body and crashed against the wall with a loud thud. Although the book caused no real harm to the ghost, the action seemed to disturb her, and she let out a piercing scream that left our eardrums ringing. Then, we heard a commotion outside. Apparently, the dorm supervisor and other students had come in response to the noise. The two ghosts seemed to be wary of footsteps, their figures flickering before vanishing without a trace. The temperature in the dorm gradually returned to normal, and the flickering lights stabilized. We collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, our fear undiminished. From that night onward, especially on moonless nights, we were haunted by the midnight crying and the potential presence of ghosts. That bone-chilling feeling made us reluctant to sleep easily in the dorm.